On the afternoon of September 19, 1978, Thomas Richard Caldwell sat in a conference room on the fourth floor of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, listening to a proposal that would either end his career or redefine it. He was 31 years old, a mid-level intelligence officer who had spent the past 6 years working counterintelligence cases focused primarily on Soviet diplomatic personnel operating out of the embassy in Washington. His work had been methodical, unglamorous, and largely successful in the quiet way that most counterintelligence work succeeds, by preventing things from happening rather than making dramatic things happen. But what was being proposed to him that afternoon was neither methodical nor quiet. It was an infiltration operation targeting one of the most sensitive Soviet facilities in existence, a nuclear weapon storage site in the Kola Peninsula, approximately 100 miles from the border with Norway and deep within Soviet territory where no American intelligence officer had ever successfully penetrated. The man presenting the proposal was James Edward Morrison, Deputy Chief of the Soviet and East European Division, a veteran officer who had served in Moscow during the late 1960s and who carried the kind of operational experience that commanded respect even from officers who disagreed with his methods. Morrison explained that CIA had received information from a source within the Soviet Ministry of Defense indicating that the facility, designated Object 47, was experiencing security vulnerabilities due to recent personnel reassignments and administrative chaos following the death of a senior KGB officer who had overseen security protocols for the previous decade. The source had provided diagrams of the facility's layout, shift schedules for the perimeter guards, and a window of opportunity that would close within 6 weeks when a new security chief was expected to arrive and implement stricter protocols. The objective, Morrison said, was straightforward in concept, but extraordinarily complex in execution. Caldwell would be inserted into Soviet territory via submarine drop off the northern coast, make his way to the facility using forged identification and cover documentation that would position him as a civilian contractor conducting routine maintenance on electrical systems, gain access to the storage bunkers, photograph whatever weaponry and technical documentation he could access, and exfiltrate through the same route within 72 hours. Caldwell listened without interrupting, a discipline he had learned early in his career when working undercover in Istanbul during his first overseas assignment. He noted the details Morrison provided, the names of the personnel involved in planning the operation, the technical specifications of the camera equipment he would carry, the communication protocols he would use if compromise seemed imminent, and the contingency plans if extraction became impossible. When Morrison finished, Caldwell asked 3 questions. First, what was the assessed probability that the source providing this information was genuine and not a dangle operation designed to lure CIA into a trap? Second, what was the operational support structure inside Soviet territory if things went wrong and he needed emergency assistance? Third, what was the intelligence value of the information he might obtain, and how would it justify the risk of his capture and the potential exposure of CIA's operational methods to Soviet counterintelligence? Morrison answered the first question with measured honesty. The source had been producing reliable information for approximately 18 months and had passed 2 polygraph examinations administered by CIA Technical Services personnel during debriefings in Vienna. However, the possibility that he had been turned or was operating under KGB control could not be entirely eliminated, and Caldwell would be proceeding with that risk fully acknowledged. The second question received a less satisfactory answer. There would be no operational support inside Soviet territory beyond pre-positioned emergency caches containing currency, forged documents, and basic survival equipment at 3 locations between the facility and the Norwegian border. If Caldwell was compromised, his only realistic option would be to attempt escape across the border on his own, a journey that would require approximately 120 miles of movement through hostile territory while evading Soviet military and KGB pursuit. The third question prompted Morrison to pull a classified assessment from his briefcase and slide it across the table. The assessment, prepared by CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, estimated that Object 47 housed a significant portion of the Soviet Union's tactical nuclear weapons designated for use by Northern Fleet forces in the event of conflict with NATO. More importantly, the assessment suggested that recent intelligence indicated the Soviets had begun deploying a new generation of nuclear warheads with enhanced yield-to-weight ratios, weapons that could fundamentally alter the strategic balance by allowing Soviet forces to deliver more devastating strikes using existing delivery systems. Photographs and technical specifications of these warheads would provide CIA with critical intelligence about Soviet nuclear capabilities, information that would inform defense planning, arms control negotiations, and strategic assessments for years to come. Caldwell read the assessment twice, absorbing the implications, and then he looked up at Morrison and said he would need 48 hours to consider the proposal and discuss it with his wife, who had no knowledge of the classified nature of his work, but who deserved to understand in the most general terms possible that he was being asked to undertake an assignment that carried significantly higher risk than his previous work. Morrison agreed, and the meeting concluded with an understanding that Caldwell would provide his answer no later than noon on September 21st. Caldwell drove home that evening to a townhouse in McLean, a 20-minute commute from Langley, and found his wife Catherine in the kitchen preparing dinner. She was 28 years old, a former high school teacher who had left her position after their daughter was born 2 years earlier, and she had adapted to the constraints of being married to an intelligence officer with a combination of patience and occasional frustration that Caldwell found both admirable and guilt-inducing. He told her that evening, after their daughter was asleep, that his work was likely to require extended travel in the coming months and that he might be unreachable for periods of time that could stretch to several weeks. Catherine asked where he would be going, and when he explained that he could not provide specifics, she did not press the issue. Instead, she asked whether he wanted to do this work, whether it meant something to him beyond professional obligation. Caldwell thought about that question for a long time, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold, and eventually he told her that he believed the work mattered, that it served a purpose larger than his own comfort or safety, and that he had volunteered for this career because he thought intelligence work, done correctly and ethically, could prevent wars rather than start them. Catherine accepted that answer with a quiet nod, and 2 days later, Caldwell walked back into Morrison's office and said he would take the assignment. The operational planning began immediately and consumed the next 5 weeks. Caldwell was transferred temporarily to a CIA training facility outside Williamsburg, Virginia, where he underwent intensive preparation that included advanced surveillance detection techniques, evasion and escape procedures, cold weather survival training, and familiarization with Soviet bureaucratic protocols and military security procedures. He was briefed by technical specialists on the camera equipment he would carry, a modified Minox camera concealed within a fountain pen that could photograph documents in low-light conditions, and that contained enough film for approximately 40 exposures. He practiced assembling and disassembling the device blindfolded until he could do it in under 30 seconds. The estimated time window he would have if he needed to photograph documents while a Soviet guard was momentarily distracted or absent. He studied maps of the Kola Peninsula, memorizing terrain features, roads, towns, military installations, and potential routes to the Norwegian border. He learned basic Norwegian in case he managed to cross the border and needed to communicate with Norwegian authorities or civilians before making contact with CIA personnel. He reviewed biographical files on Soviet personnel assigned to Object 47, learning their names, their backgrounds, their personal habits, any information that might prove useful if he encountered them during the operation. The cover story that CIA developed for Caldwell was constructed with meticulous attention to detail, designed to withstand scrutiny from Soviet security personnel, while providing plausible justification for his presence at Object 47. He would enter Soviet territory using the identity of Sergei Mikhailovich Volkov, a civilian electrical engineer employed by a state enterprise based in Murmansk that contracted maintenance services to military facilities throughout the Kola Peninsula. The real Sergei Volkov was a mid-level bureaucrat who had died 3 months earlier in a traffic accident outside Leningrad, but whose death had not yet been fully processed through Soviet administrative channels due to backlogs and inefficiencies endemic to the system. CIA had obtained Volkov's identification documents through a source within Soviet civil administration, and technical services personnel had modified the photographs and physical descriptions to match Caldwell's appearance. The documents were aged appropriately, complete with stamps, signatures, and watermarks that would pass inspection unless subjected to laboratory analysis. Caldwell's Russian language skills were native level, the result of growing up in a household where his grandmother had spoken only Russian and had insisted that he maintain fluency as a connection to his heritage. His accent matched the regional patterns common to Western Russia, and during practice sessions with native Russian speakers, he was able to maintain his cover without linguistic inconsistencies that might trigger suspicion. On October 28, 1978, Caldwell boarded a military transport aircraft at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington and flew to Naval Station Keflavik in Iceland, where he was transferred to a support vessel that took him approximately 200 miles offshore into the Norwegian Sea. At that location, under cover of darkness and heavy weather that limited visibility, he transferred to the USS Richard B. Russell, a nuclear-powered attack submarine that had been conducting routine surveillance operations along the edge of Soviet territorial waters. The submarine's commanding officer, Commander William Patrick Hayes, was a career naval officer with 19 years of service who had been briefed on the operation at the most general level and who understood that Caldwell was a CIA officer being inserted into Soviet territory for intelligence collection purposes. Hayes made clear during their initial meeting that he considered the operation high risk and potentially reckless, but he also made clear that he would provide whatever support his orders required, and that the submarine and its crew were prepared to execute the insertion and extraction with precision. The submarine proceeded north at slow speed, staying well outside the 12-mile territorial limit while gradually approaching the Soviet coast, and on the night of October 30th, it moved into position approximately 8 miles offshore at a location where coastal surveillance was assessed to be minimal due to terrain features and limited radar coverage. Caldwell prepared for insertion just after midnight, changing into cold water survival gear that included a dry suit, thermal underlayers, and equipment pouches containing his forged documents, camera, currency, emergency supplies, and a compact radio transmitter that he could use to signal his readiness for extraction once the mission was complete. 2 Navy SEALs would accompany him during the initial phase, piloting an inflatable boat to within 1 mile of shore before Caldwell would complete the journey alone using a smaller kayak that could be more easily concealed once he reached land. Commander Hayes briefed Caldwell one final time, reviewing extraction procedures and confirming the radio frequencies and code phrases that would trigger submarine response. The atmosphere aboard the submarine was tense, professional, and marked by the understanding that the men in the control room were facilitating an operation they could not fully comprehend or control. At precisely 0147 hours, Caldwell climbed through the submarine's forward escape trunk and into the inflatable boat. The 2 SEALs followed, and the boat separated from the submarine with minimal noise, its electric motor barely audible above the sound of waves against the hull. The journey to the 1-mile mark took 38 minutes, navigating through darkness and choppy seas that made steering difficult and required constant adjustment to maintain course. When the SEALs signaled that they had reached the designated position, Caldwell transferred to the kayak, secured his equipment, and began paddling toward the Soviet coast. The coastline appeared as a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky, indistinct and foreboding, and Caldwell maintained a steady rhythm, focusing on the physical mechanics of paddling to suppress the awareness that he was crossing an invisible line beyond which he would have no protection, no backup, no support beyond his own skills and preparation. He reached shore at approximately 03:15 hours, pulled the kayak above the tide line, and concealed it beneath rocks and driftwood in a manner that would prevent casual discovery while allowing him to locate it again during exfiltration. He changed out of the dry suit and into civilian clothing appropriate for a Soviet worker, stowing the survival gear in a waterproof bag that he buried in a marked location approximately 50 meters inland. Then he began walking, using a compass and his memorized knowledge of the terrain to navigate toward the main coastal road that would lead to the town of Polyarny, approximately 14 miles south of his landing point. The temperature was near freezing, the wind cutting through his jacket, and he walked quickly to generate warmth and to cover ground before daylight increased the risk of encountering military patrols or civilians who might question his presence. He reached the coastal road at approximately 05:30 hours, the sky beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn, and he waited in a concealed position until a truck appeared, a military vehicle transporting supplies toward Polyarny. Caldwell stepped onto the road and flagged down the truck, presenting his forged documents and explaining that his car had broken down several kilometers back and that he needed to reach Polyarny to arrange repair services before reporting to his work assignment at a facility in the interior. The driver, a young soldier who appeared barely 20 years old, examined the documents without particular interest, asked a few routine questions about where Caldwell worked and why he was traveling so early in the morning, and then motioned for him to climb into the passenger seat. The truck smelled of diesel fuel and cigarette smoke, the heater barely functional, and the soldier talked continuously during the 20-minute drive, complaining about the cold, about the monotony of his assignment, about his girlfriend back in Rostov who had stopped writing letters. Caldwell responded with appropriate comments, maintaining the persona of a civilian worker who was tired and preoccupied with his own concerns, and when the truck reached the outskirts of Polyarny, he thanked the soldier, climbed down, and walked into the town as the morning shift began and workers emerged from apartment buildings to board buses heading toward various military and industrial facilities. Polyarny was a closed city, restricted to military personnel and approved civilians, and its streets reflected the utilitarian aesthetics common to Soviet military installations. Grey concrete apartment blocks, functional but stark, lined roads that were cracked and poorly maintained. A handful of shops provided basic goods, but the shelves were sparsely stocked, and the people moving through the town carried themselves with the resigned efficiency of individuals navigating a system that offered limited choices. Caldwell boarded a bus designated for workers heading to facilities in the Okolnaya Bay region, showing his documents to a security officer who glanced at them briefly before waving him through. The bus departed at 06:50 hours, following a route that wound through hills and forests, stopping at checkpoints where guards verified passenger credentials before allowing the bus to continue. At 08:20 hours, the bus reached the final checkpoint before Object 47, a reinforced gate manned by 4 armed guards and equipped with barriers designed to stop vehicles that attempted to force entry. Caldwell disembarked with approximately 30 other workers, queued at the security station, and presented his documents along with a work order indicating that he had been assigned to inspect and repair electrical systems in administrative buildings within the facility perimeter. The security officer examined the documents with more attention than the soldier on the truck or the guard on the bus, comparing the photograph to Caldwell's face, checking the stamps and signatures, asking questions about the nature of the work order and who had authorized it. Caldwell responded with confidence, citing names that had been provided in his operational briefing, referencing bureaucratic procedures and technical specifications in language that sounded authentic because he had spent weeks studying Soviet administrative protocols and military jargon. The security officer hesitated, picked up a telephone, made a call to someone inside the facility, spoke briefly, and then hung up and stamped the work order with approval. Caldwell was directed to wait in a holding area while an escort was summoned, and 15 minutes later, a KGB officer appeared, a man in his mid-40s with a weathered face and an expression that suggested decades of dealing with contractors, bureaucrats, and personnel who required supervision. The officer introduced himself as Captain Leonid Borisovich Kruglov, verified Caldwell's identity once more, and then led him through the gate and into the facility. Object 47 was larger than Caldwell had anticipated based on the diagrams he had studied during operational planning. The facility sprawled across approximately 2 square kilometers, encompassing administrative buildings, storage bunkers built into hillsides, guard towers positioned at regular intervals along the perimeter fence, and vehicle maintenance areas where trucks and specialized transport equipment were parked. The bunkers were the primary target, reinforced concrete structures with heavy blast doors that would require sophisticated equipment to breach, but which might be accessible during Caldwell's cover work if he could establish credibility with facility personnel and identify opportunities to gain entry under plausible pretexts. Captain Kruglov explained that electrical problems had been reported in the administrative complex, intermittent power failures that suggested wiring issues or transformer malfunctions, and that Caldwell was expected to diagnose the problem and perform repairs within 2 days. He was assigned temporary quarters in a barracks building used by contract workers, warned that unauthorized movement within the facility would result in immediate detention and arrest, and then escorted to the administrative building where the reported electrical issues were located. Caldwell spent the first day conducting legitimate work, inspecting wiring, testing circuits, identifying problems that were genuine and that required repair. He worked methodically, documenting his findings, interacting with facility personnel in ways that established him as competent and professional, someone who understood his job and who posed no threat. He made small talk with clerical staff, asked about the facility's history, expressed admiration for Soviet engineering while subtly probing for information about security protocols and personnel schedules. By the end of the first day, he had learned that the storage bunkers were accessed only by authorized personnel using electronic key cards that were changed weekly, that deliveries and maintenance operations involving the bunkers occurred primarily during night shifts when fewer personnel were present, and that a major inventory inspection was scheduled for the following week, which had created administrative chaos as personnel scrambled to prepare documentation. That evening, Caldwell returned to his assigned quarters, recorded his observations in a small notebook using coded notations that would be meaningless to anyone who discovered it, and considered his next moves. He had confirmed the general layout of the facility, but he had not yet identified a plausible method for accessing the storage bunkers without triggering suspicion. The opportunity presented itself on the second day, unexpectedly and through circumstances that Caldwell could not have anticipated during operational planning. A transformer failed in one of the administrative buildings, causing a power outage that affected not only offices but also security systems monitoring several of the storage bunkers. Captain Kruglov summoned Caldwell urgently, explaining that the outage needed to be resolved immediately because backup generators could only sustain critical systems for a limited time, and regulations required that power be restored to all security systems within 4 hours, or the facility would be placed on elevated alert status, which would disrupt the upcoming inventory inspection and generate scrutiny from headquarters in Moscow. Caldwell accompanied Kruglov to the transformer station, diagnosed the problem as a burned-out component that would require replacement parts not immediately available on site, and suggested that temporary power could be rerouted from another transformer if he could access the electrical junction boxes located near the affected bunkers. Kruglov hesitated, understanding the security implications of allowing a contractor near the bunkers, but the urgency of the situation and the administrative pressures he faced overcame his caution. He authorized Caldwell to proceed under escort, assigning 2 armed guards to accompany him, and emphasized that any attempt to deviate from the specified work area would result in immediate use of force. Caldwell worked quickly and professionally, opening junction boxes, testing circuits, running temporary cables to restore power. The guards watched him closely but without apparent suspicion, and as he worked he observed details that would be critical for the intelligence value of his mission. He noted the design of the bunker doors, the locking mechanisms, the electronic access systems, the placement of surveillance cameras. One of the guards, a conscript who appeared bored and uncomfortable standing in the cold, began talking to Caldwell about civilian life, asking about work opportunities outside the military, expressing frustration with the monotony of guard duty at a facility where nothing ever happened except routine inspections and occasional maintenance problems. Caldwell engaged the conversation, sympathizing with the soldiers' frustrations, mentioning that he had served his own military obligation years earlier and understood how tedious such assignments could be. The conversation continued as Caldwell completed the temporary power restoration, and during a moment when the second guard had walked several meters away to smoke a cigarette, the first guard mentioned casually that the bunkers contained weapons so powerful they could destroy entire cities, but that most of the guards had never actually seen them because only senior officers and specialized technicians were permitted inside during inventory operations. Caldwell asked innocent questions, expressing curiosity about the weapons in the manner of someone with no particular agenda beyond normal human interest in things kept secret. The guard, emboldened by Caldwell's apparent trustworthiness and perhaps by the opportunity to share knowledge that made him feel important, described what he had heard from other personnel. The weapons were smaller than older generation devices, he said, compact enough that a single truck could carry multiple warheads, and they had been delivered to the facility over the past 6 months as part of a modernization program. He did not know technical specifications or yields, but he had overheard officers discussing deployment scenarios and had formed the impression that these weapons represented a significant enhancement to Soviet tactical nuclear capabilities. Caldwell absorbed this information without showing excessive interest, thanked the guard for the conversation, completed his work, and returned with his escort to the administrative complex. That evening, he documented everything he had learned, including the guard's comments and his own observations of the bunker security systems, and he began considering how he might gain access to the bunkers themselves during the remaining time before his scheduled departure from the facility. The opportunity came during the night shift on his 3rd day at Object 47. The inventory inspection had begun earlier than scheduled due to pressure from Moscow, and facility personnel were working extended hours to complete documentation and physical counts of stored weapons. Caldwell had completed his assigned electrical repairs and was preparing to depart the facility the following morning. But Captain Kruglov approached him that evening and requested assistance with another electrical problem, this time involving lighting systems inside one of the storage bunkers where inventory personnel were working. The lighting had failed unexpectedly, creating delays in the inspection process, and replacement bulbs and fixtures were needed immediately to avoid further disruptions. Kruglov explained that normally such work would be performed by facility maintenance personnel, but they were overwhelmed with other tasks related to the inventory, and he was authorized to request Caldwell's assistance as a temporary measure. Caldwell agreed without hesitation, understanding that this was the access he had been seeking, and he followed Kruglov to Storage Bunker 7, one of several structures built into a hillside and secured with multiple layers of physical and electronic protection. The bunker entrance was guarded by 2 KGB officers who verified Caldwell's credentials and then accompanied him and Kruglov through the blast doors and into the interior. The bunker was approximately 60 meters long, lined with metal storage racks that held cylindrical containers, each marked with alphanumeric codes and warning labels indicating hazardous materials and restricted access. Inventory personnel were working at the far end of the bunker, counting containers and comparing physical counts to documentation, their work illuminated by portable lights that cast harsh shadows against the concrete walls. Caldwell was directed to the lighting panels near the entrance, and he began diagnosing the problem while his escorts watched. The lighting failure was genuine, caused by a tripped circuit breaker rather than any malfunction, and Caldwell reset the breaker, restoring power to the overhead lights. But as he worked, he observed everything around him with trained attention to detail. He noted the number of containers, their dimensions, the markings on the labels, the layout of the storage system. He estimated that the bunker held approximately 40 containers, each presumably containing a nuclear warhead or components for warhead assembly, and he committed these observations to memory with the understanding that he would need to record them immediately once he was out of the bunker. As he prepared to leave, one of the inventory personnel called out to Kruglov, reporting that several containers had identification numbers that did not match the inventory documentation, creating confusion about whether the containers had been mislabeled or whether the documentation was incorrect. Kruglov cursed under his breath, understanding the administrative problems this would create, and he walked to the far end of the bunker to investigate. The guards followed him, leaving Caldwell briefly unobserved near the entrance. The opportunity lasted perhaps 20 seconds, barely enough time for considered action, but Caldwell had trained for precisely such moments. He reached into his jacket pocket, extracted the modified fountain pen camera, aimed it at the nearest storage racks, and triggered 3 rapid exposures, capturing images of the containers and their labels. He returned the camera to his pocket, resumed examining the lighting panel as if still verifying that repairs were complete, and when Kruglov returned several minutes later, Caldwell reported that the problem had been resolved and that the lighting systems were functioning normally. Kruglov thanked him, escorted him out of the bunker, and arranged for his departure from the facility the following morning. Caldwell left Object 47 at 0800 hours on November 2, 1978, boarding the same bus that had brought him to the facility 3 days earlier. His work order had been stamped as completed, his temporary credentials surrendered to security personnel, and he carried with him nothing that would indicate he had engaged in espionage beyond the modified fountain pen camera concealed in his jacket and the observations stored in his memory. The bus returned him to Polyarny, where he disembarked and began walking toward the coastal road, retracing the route he had used during insertion. He retrieved his buried survival gear, changed into cold-weather clothing, and made his way to the concealed kayak as darkness fell and the risk of observation decreased. The extraction occurred without incident. Caldwell paddled into the darkness, following the bearing he had memorized, and after approximately 90 minutes he reached the designated extraction point where the USS Richard B. Russell was waiting, submerged with periscope raised. He signaled using a waterproof flashlight with a coded sequence. The submarine surfaced, and Navy personnel pulled him aboard through the forward escape trunk. Commander Hayes greeted him briefly, confirmed that he was uninjured and had not been followed, and then ordered the submarine to dive and proceed away from Soviet territorial waters at maximum safe speed. The intelligence that Caldwell obtained during his 3 days at Object 47 was processed and analyzed by CIA technical specialists over the following weeks. The photographs he had taken inside Storage Bunker 7, though limited to 3 exposures, provided critical information about the design and specifications of Soviet tactical nuclear warheads that had not been available through other intelligence collection methods. The containers visible in the photographs were marked with codes that intelligence analysts cross-referenced with information obtained from other sources, including signals intelligence and human intelligence reporting from Soviet military personnel. The analysis confirmed that the warhead stored at Object 47 represented a new generation of enhanced radiation weapons, commonly known as neutron bombs, designed to maximize radiation effects while minimizing blast damage, making them particularly effective against armored formations and personnel while reducing collateral damage to infrastructure. The deployment of these weapons to forward locations like Object 47 indicated that Soviet military doctrine was evolving toward tactical nuclear options that could be used in regional conflicts without necessarily escalating to strategic nuclear exchange, a development that had significant implications for NATO defense planning and arms control negotiations. The photographs also revealed technical details about warhead miniaturization that suggested Soviet nuclear weapons technology had advanced beyond previous CIA assessments. The compact size of the containers and the density of storage within the bunker indicated that Soviet engineers had achieved yield-to-weight ratios comparable to or exceeding American weapons of similar yield, eliminating what had been perceived as a technological advantage for the United States. This information prompted reassessments of Soviet nuclear capabilities across multiple CIA and Defense Department analytical divisions, influencing weapons development programs, strategic planning scenarios, and intelligence collection priorities for the remainder of the Cold War. The operational debriefings that Caldwell underwent following his return to the United States focused extensively on the methods he had used to gain access to the storage bunker and the vulnerabilities he had observed in Soviet security procedures. CIA counterintelligence officers were particularly interested in whether Caldwell believed his cover had been compromised or whether Soviet security personnel had suspected his true purpose. Caldwell's assessment was that his cover had remained intact throughout the operation, that the electrical contractor identity had provided plausible justification for his presence at the facility, and that the urgency created by the inventory inspection had created circumstances under which security protocols were relaxed in favor of operational necessity. However, he also noted that the operation had succeeded in part due to factors beyond his control, including the transformer failure and the willingness of facility personnel to accept his credentials without extensive verification, factors that might not be repeatable in future operations. The success of the operation prompted discussions within CIA about whether similar infiltration attempts should be conducted against other Soviet nuclear facilities, but these discussions were ultimately constrained by concerns about the risks involved and the potential for catastrophic failure if an officer was captured and interrogated. The political climate of the late 1970s, characterized by détente and arms control negotiations, made the prospect of exposing American intelligence operations inside Soviet territory particularly sensitive, and senior CIA leadership determined that the risks of additional operations outweighed the potential intelligence gains unless circumstances changed dramatically. Caldwell returned to his previous assignment in counterintelligence at CIA headquarters, and the operation at Object 47 was classified at the highest levels of secrecy, with access restricted to a small number of officers and analysts who had operational or analytical need to know. The intelligence derived from the operation was sanitized and distributed through channels that concealed its origins, ensuring that policymakers and military planners could benefit from the information without exposing the methods used to obtain it. The personal impact of the operation on Caldwell was profound and complicated. He had succeeded in penetrating one of the most secure Soviet facilities in existence, obtaining intelligence that would influence American defense policy for years, and he had done so without injury, capture, or compromise. But the psychological weight of operating alone in hostile territory, the constant awareness that a single mistake or piece of bad luck could result in arrest, interrogation, and imprisonment, left him with a level of stress that did not dissipate immediately upon his return. His wife Catherine noticed changes in his behavior, increased tension, difficulty sleeping, moments of distraction when he seemed lost in thoughts he could not share. He did not discuss the operation with her, and she did not ask for details beyond confirming that he had returned safely, but the distance created by his inability to share what he had experienced became a quiet presence in their relationship, something they both acknowledged without fully addressing. In the years following the operation, Caldwell continued working in intelligence, rising through the ranks of CIA's counterintelligence division and eventually serving overseas assignments in Vienna and Berlin during the 1980s. He participated in operations against Soviet intelligence officers, recruited sources, analyzed intelligence reporting, and trained younger officers in tradecraft and operational security. But the operation at Object 47 remained the defining experience of his career, the mission that demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of human intelligence collection against hardened targets. The intelligence value of what he obtained justified the risks he took, but the operation also highlighted the fragility of success, the dependence on circumstances that could not be controlled, and the reality that even the most carefully planned operations could fail due to factors that planners could not anticipate. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the nuclear weapons stored at facilities like Object 47 were gradually dismantled or transferred to Russian Federation control under arms reduction agreements negotiated between the United States and Russia. The intelligence that Caldwell obtained in 1978 became historical documentation rather than current operational intelligence, but its contribution to American understanding of Soviet nuclear capabilities during a critical period of the Cold War remained significant. Caldwell retired from CIA in 2003 after 30 years of service, and he settled with Catherine in a quiet neighborhood outside Charlottesville, Virginia. He did not speak publicly about his work, and the operation at Object 47 remained classified long after his retirement. The details emerged gradually through declassification processes and historical research, revealing to scholars and historians a glimpse of the human intelligence operations that complemented signals intelligence and satellite reconnaissance during the Cold War. The operation demonstrated that even in an era of advanced technical collection capabilities, there remained intelligence requirements that could only be satisfied by placing trained officers in dangerous situations where success depended on preparation, skill, and the kind of courage that accepts risk without guarantee of safety. Caldwell died in 2019 at the age of 72, and his obituary in the Washington Post noted his career in government service without mentioning the classified work that had defined it. His family received letters from former colleagues expressing condolences and respect, and several of those letters contained careful language suggesting that Caldwell had contributed to national security in ways that could not be publicly acknowledged, but that those who knew understood and valued. The legacy of the operation at Object 47 exists in the archives of CIA in the intelligence assessments that were informed by the photographs Caldwell obtained, in the arms control negotiations that were shaped by improved understanding of Soviet nuclear capabilities, and in the training programs that use the operation as a case study for teaching officers about the planning, execution, and risks of human intelligence collection in denied areas. The operation was neither the largest nor the most dramatic intelligence success of the Cold War, but it represented something essential about the nature of espionage, the willingness of individuals to accept extraordinary personal risk in pursuit of information that serves purposes larger than themselves, and the complexity of determining whether such risks are justified by the intelligence obtained. Thomas Richard Caldwell volunteered for an assignment that could have ended his life or his freedom, succeeded through a combination of skill and circumstance, and returned with intelligence that influenced American policy during a period when miscalculation about Soviet capabilities could have led to catastrophic consequences. The operation succeeded, but it succeeded because dozens of factors aligned in ways that could not be guaranteed, and the difference between success and failure was often nothing more than luck, timing, and the human capacity to function under pressure that most people never experience. That is the reality of espionage, and it is a reality that Caldwell understood when he accepted the assignment and that stayed with him for the rest of his life.